My name is Emily Hill. I'm Education Coordinator in Canadian Ministries here at the National Office of the Presbyterian Church of Canada. I just want to say a warm welcome to all of you who joined us now and those who will be joining us watching this later on the web. We're very happy and pleased that you've taken this time out of your busy day to join us to learn about ecumenical shared ministries. Just a couple of housekeeping items to start. You will probably be able to see that this session is being recorded and it will be posted on the web later. So that's a good thing to be aware of just as we move through and any type of questions you may be asking. You will be asking questions through the chat function. You can see that in the little, what would you call it, like sidebar that you have. There's a chat function. And you can ask questions at any time during the presentation. We'll be kind of saving most of them for towards the end, but I'll be the host and I'll be monitoring the questions and keeping track of them. And so yes, you're being recorded and the questions go in the chat box. That's the reason that you are on mute and that you aren't able to share your webcam, just because it gets too noisy in the background if everyone's volume is on. So thank you very much for that. And I think that's about it. I see that we have a couple more people joining us now. So thanks for coming. And I would like to thank the Reverend Dr. Emily Bissett and the Reverend Ian Ross McDonald for joining us today. Emily is the Minister of Word and Sacrament at Calvin Presbyterian Church in Toronto, which is an ecumenical shared ministry with Deer Park United Church. And we also have the Reverend Ian Ross McDonald, who's the General Secretary of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. So Ian was Emily's predecessor at Calvin, and he was the minister who helped to establish the ecumenical shared ministry. He's here to share his expertise on starting such a ministry. And Emily came to Calvin after the congregations had already begun that partnership, and but she's been working with them for several years now. So she will be able to speak to the ongoing life together of an ecumenical shared ministry. So they do have a PowerPoint. I'm going to be turning off my webcam and my volume for the moment, and I'm going to turn it over to them. So thank you very much, Emily and Ian, for putting this presentation together and for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us. We're very excited to see what you have to say. So I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Emily. Happy to be here today and happy to talk about ecumenical shared ministry, which is the life that I live every day in going to work and the kind of ministry that we're able to do at Calvin Presbyterian, largely because of the shared ministry that we have with Deer Park United. So it's great to be here and talk to all of you, and I'm glad to see some of you joining us. It would be very helpful to Ian and I if you would take a moment and tell us in the chat box if you have any experience of ecumenical shared ministry, if you're coming to this because you want to know.
Or by turning on.
You can turn on your sound and tell us. That would be really helpful to us so that we know where you're coming from and what you may be hoping that we talk about today, particularly with such a small group. It would be good if we were useful to you in what you're hoping to get out of this hour that we have together.
Perhaps we could turn the microphones on alphabetically, beginning with Gail Allen. If there's anything that Gail has to share or any questions that she has for us as we get started.
Hi, no, nothing particular. I'm interested in ecumenical shared ministries, as that's part of my work with the United Church. And I'm part of the National Ecumenical Shared Ministries Task Group with others from denominations that often share in shared ministry. I'm also I'm on sabbatical and I'm going on a trip to London and looking forward to some opportunities to meet with some folks who are involved in some of the shared ministries in Britain. I've got a couple of meetings, so interested to take what I hear there.
Gail, are you in the office with the United Church or in one of the regional areas?
I'm in the national. I'm the coordinator for ecumenical and interfaith ministry, or faith relations. So I'm in the national office, except not right now. I'm in Calgary.
Wonderful.
Good, Gail. It's great to have you. So then we have Derek. if we could turn on your mic and share with us a little bit about where you are and what you hope to learn in this conversation or contribute to it.
Hi, I'm Derek Ellsworth. I'm a United Church minister in rural Nova Scotia and a 3-point pastoral charge, which is exploring with our neighboring Presbyterian congregations some ecumenical shared ministry. So I'm looking forward to hearing a bit from the Presbyterian perspective.
Derek, whereabouts are you in Nova Scotia?
In Pictou County, Guysborough County, in the St. Mary's area.
Oh, great.
Great. It's good to have somebody who's kind of right in the mix of it and trying to figure out whether it's something that will work where you are. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Doug.
Pardon me as I get the mic going. My interest is that it's often difficult enough to get congregations of the same denomination to work together in shared ministry. So I was quite interested on the subject of ecumenically shared ministry, because in rural Bruce County, all denominations of the mainline churches are shrinking almost to the point of non-existence.
Thank you.
Great. And Margaret. We'll skip over to Margaret.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm from Chetwynd Shared Ministry. We are 4 denominations sharing for over 30 years now. And as far as I'm concerned, this is the only way to go.
So an advocate. It's good to have an advocate around.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
We were 3 dying congregations. The Presbyterians and United are already joined at this point in time. And over a backyard barbecue, the guys suggested, why don't we all join together? And we all worked hard at it. And we've been together for over 30 years now.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Margaret. And Paul?
Hi, my name is Paul Garris. I live on Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg. I'm on staff with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada. I am a pastor, but I've been working in the office for over 12 years. I've been involved ecumenically in ecumenical discussions around what the national structures and regional structures bring to the table of ecumenical shared ministry and the things that might need to be accounted for as blocks. And so I got an invitation through our ecumenical officer to be here today. So I guess the best thing to do is just to keep listening for how the structures can get in the way of what needs to happen for ecumenical ministry to be effective.
Hmm.
It's great to have a real mix of people who are in it or have been doing it for a while and
Might want to.
Might want to.
Yeah. Great.
That'll make this a more useful resource, I think, for people who look at it later, that we have so many people involved in it in one way or another.
Good. No, I think just to tell you a little bit of what we have planned to do for this time together is first to just do some of the general things around ecumenical sharing and what it is and what it means, what it can look like. And then Ian and I will speak particularly about a case study, as it were, of Calvin Presbyterian joining with Deer Park United and how that came to be, what were some of the things that needed to be attended to as the congregations considered coming together, as they came together, and now as they live together. And hopefully through the lens of that case study, we can see the larger picture of what's possible.
So just quickly, I think we'll run through a few PowerPoint slides. Some of this will be review or material that people already know, but it will be helpful to others perhaps to talk a little bit about what ecumenical sharing is and also draw attention to the ecumenical shared ministry document. So on the screen now, we hope that there's a slide there that you can see. Ecumenical Shared Ministry Handbook. This is a resource that's available through the church. I believe there are versions of it on the United Church website, the various Anglican websites, and the Presbyterian. I wasn't able to find it on a Lutheran site, but it is a document that was put together by those 4 denominations. And in terms of the Presbyterian Church, you can find it at presbyterian.ca Ecumenical Handbook. It's very easy to find it with a simple search on the webpage, on the other denominational web pages. The Ecumenical Shared Ministry Handbook is a very helpful resource. The congregations of Deer Park, United, and Calvin found it very helpful. You can see there the items that are in the table of contents, as well as in the appendices. Really covers the basics of what any congregation might need to think about. In lots of ways, we found this ministry handbook a useful jumping off point. We used it as a resource to get us started talking, and it raised some good questions, answered some good questions, but it was an invaluable resource to get us started. This is a list of ecumenical shared ministries in the Presbyterian Church in Canada that we keep a list of. A quick look through the list shows that we have ecumenical shared ministries from coast to coast. And you can also see that the majority of the congregations that Presbyterian congregations are in ministry with are united. However, not exclusively. We thought this might be a useful resource for people to have so that they could see what what's being done in the area that's close to them, but also to see the variety of ministries and formulations of this across the country. And Chetwynd, you can see there down in the Peace River, is second from the bottom. And that's Anglican, Evangelical, Lutheran, Presbyterian, and United. As far as we know, there may be other denominations or people from other denominations in that group as well, but I think formally that's the makeup. Just to talk a little bit about what an ecumenical shared ministry is, it's generally shared ministry is people worshiping and serving God in a unified way while still maintaining denominational identity and connections, whatever they may be. There's any number of combinations that could be created that would fulfill the definition of an ecumenical shared ministry. As you can see, it could be anything from simply sharing programs or simply sharing a mission to more formalized things like sharing worship, pastoral ministries, or sharing a building. And this is a list taken from the Ecumenical Shared Ministry Handbook about what some of the combinations might be, but in no way is it limited to these various combinations that are listed there.
One of the things that Ian and I were talking about as we prepared for our conversation was how important it is to remember that ecumenical shared ministry is a creative and generative kind of ministry. It's not a last resort. It's not, it often is precipitated by a crisis, as some of you identified, and was the case partly for Calvin Deer Park around buildings and congregations needing space to be, but it doesn't have to be that way. Ecumenical shared ministry can take place in just about any setting with lots of different combinations, as you've seen there, and really is a way of revitalizing ministry, and probably is better when it's done before it needs to be done. So if we could begin to think proactively around creative and generative kinds of ministries in our settings rather than waiting for crises to push us into these things, we probably would have a richer experience. And as someone already mentioned, certainly I hear at Calvin and think myself that this is a way to go forward. It's a way for us to continue to engage in ministry throughout Canada in ways that maintain our distinctions, which are important, and also give us new energy and new resources and help us to be better stewards of the gifts that we have through the church.
One of the images that I found pastorally helpful was a woman in Calvin Church who talked about aging and the need to someday move from her house. And she talked about how she would rather move earlier on her own terms and make her own decisions and sort through things by herself rather than wait until it was too late and have somebody else do it for her, which I thought was a helpful image in terms of how congregations could think about timing. But as you said, Emily, there's lots of other reasons why people may need to or want to consider this kind of ministry. Geography. Canada is such a big country that it may not make sense to have churches working in isolated ways in one area. Size, history. I think about growing up in the Maritimes in Nova Scotia and the number of churches that I recall working together even before this formalized ecumenical shared ministry concept was encoded in a book. There were United Churches and Presbyterian churches working together, sharing one minister in a multi-charge context, which I think always worked out well and was related really to the history of those congregations back to 1925 or earlier than 1925.
I think, do we have one more slide after this, or is this the end of this part? Yeah, okay. So I wonder if we might pause and see if there are any questions that you have about the general stuff, ecumenical shared ministry, what it can look like, what it is, the resources themselves, and we've got a number of different representations from denominations. If you have anything you want to add at this point before we go into the specific example of Calvin Deer Park.
And if people have something they want to add or ask, they can simply just press their microphone button. Then maybe we'll go on to an example and tell you a little bit about the successes and challenges and what we found worked and didn't work. Calvin and Deer Park are two congregations with large buildings in central Toronto. They shared a history in that before 1925, they were one congregation. In 1925, some Presbyterians, some continuing Presbyterians left the United Church, marched out of the building one Sunday morning and went and formed their own congregation, worshipped in a movie theater down the street for some time. But it wasn't long before the two congregations were again working together in some limited ways after 1925 by sharing summer services or sharing prayer services during times of crisis. There were enough connections in the neighborhood that family members, extended family members were members of Calvin and Deer Park at the same time. So there wasn't much acrimony after 1925, or as much as there was in some places. And there was a continued sharing. Through the 50s and 60s, they did share summer services a number of times during those decades. In the 2000s, both congregations began to get a little smaller. And then there was a bit of a crisis that really precipitated the conversation for the two congregations to work together more formally. The United Church was located next to Imperial Oil's headquarters. And for many years, I think for maybe 40 years or more, the United Church was receiving its heat actually from Imperial Oil's headquarters. The heat would come under the driveway and into the United Church building. And when the Imperial Oil company moved its headquarters, the heat disappeared. And Deer Park had to think about what the best use of resources would be in the future. So they started to cast about and look for other alternatives. And one of the alternatives was worshiping in the building of a church nearby. And Calvin was very close. Although equally close was another United Church, and they could have really gone to either one. From the doorstep of Deer Park United, you could really see the steeples of both a United Church and a Presbyterian Church, and they're equidistant, I think, from the front door of Deer Park Church. But for a variety of reasons related, I think, to the history of Calvin and Deer Park continuing to worship together, and also the relationship between the ministers and some of the people in the congregation, it was decided that for a time, they would come and worship at Calvin Church.
Would you say that theology was a factor in that too? That they were actually theologically closer to their Presbyterian neighbors than they were to that particular United congregation?
That's right. Yeah, Calvin and Deer Park shared a passion for justice, for involvement in the neighborhood, and some theological similarities that were not shared by the other United Church, which is probably unusual or peculiar to our situation, perhaps.
Perhaps. Although I think it's interesting in thinking about some of the people who were telling their stories around when you serve in a community where there's a number of different denominations and maybe two of the same, it may be that you have more in common with the other denominations than you do within the denomination. Sometimes that can be even more difficult than an ecumenical shared ministry.
Our orders of worship were identical, and the values around music, around the styles of worship, around preaching, our celebration of sacrament schedules were almost identical. I think it's fair to say that Calvin and Deer Park were probably a little bit more on the liberal end of things than maybe some other churches that Deer Park could have chosen to work with. So that's really how the conversation got started. Do you want to say anything more about that?
No, not in particular, although the other thing that strikes me is that in that particular scenario, Deer Park and Calvin were also similar in their leadership and similar in their size, whereas it could also, I think there was a sense that if they went with another United Church congregation, they would be subsumed into that. Deer Park would be subsumed into that congregation and not keep its distinctness as its own congregation. So this arrangement in ecumenical shared ministry in general allows you to keep your distinctness in a way that amalgamation does not. Sometimes amalgamation is the right thing to do and the right answer to what's happening in a community. But in this case, there was a strong desire that I've sensed of Deer Park wanting to maintain itself as its own congregation, which was easier to do in partnership with Calvin than it would have been with another United Church.
Yeah, and this triggers, I think, a series of pastoral concerns that we had to face early on. The question of domination and submission, or being subsumed or overtaken. Calvin was afraid, I think, that it might be invaded, and Deer Park was probably afraid it would be lost or obliterated. So this triggered a whole series of really important pastoral conversations. And we spent a lot of time on that. And I think that education was a big part of that. We had to do a lot of educating in both congregations about what the other denomination was like, what ecumenical shared ministry was, and what it was not. We had to face very squarely some of the rumors that get started because of fear, and confront those. We did a lot of shared meetings between the two congregations, and I think that I know I did more pastoral visiting than I normally did, and probably should have been doing all along, to try and speak to people directly about what their concerns were and to hear what their interests were. And it also changed my preaching and my prayers. We had to be very intentional about talking about life and death and loss and renewal. Our vocabulary changed a little bit in worship, in very intentional ways. We had a good long time to prepare for this, about 5 or 6 months intently, and a little bit longer as we thought about it a bit. So it really gave us a chance to think about it and do a lot of intentional things, and to begin to address the questions around, I think, and loss and gain, and to confront also the feelings in Calvin that they might be winning something because they got to keep their building, and the idea that Deer Park might be losing something because they were leaving their building. But we had to talk about how both sides were going to gain and both sides were going to lose, and to also confront the problem of two sides, that there were not two sides. There were a variety of approaches to this, and that if we were going to think about this in a divisive way or
or even a hero.
Yeah.
You know, Calvin's gonna save Deer Park, or Deer Park means refuge.
Yeah.
Even though there was a sense of coming, at the beginning at least, just coming to rest and figure things out. Where do we want to go as a congregation? Deer Park had a lot of those questions. But you're talking about all of this discernment work happened before the two came together at all. Is that right?
A lot
and
of
continued.
it. And prepared the ground for what I anticipated would happen when we all got in the same building. That if my feeling was that if we got enough of the concerns out and aired and addressed, it would be preparing good ground for the success later. Some of it, I have to confess, was striking while the iron was cold. We were confronting questions and issues that we had not yet encountered, but that we knew we would someday.
Yeah.
And we did practical things. We exchanged ministers. Sometimes I would go and preach at Deer Park, and the minister at Deer Park would come and preach at Calvin, even when we weren't together.
Good. I think what we still see at Calvin and Deer Park, that's part of that coming together, was the sharing of resources, both physical resources. In the sanctuary right now, we have what was the Calvin communion table in its original place, but we've created a new space in the sanctuary for the Deer Park communion table, which we use alternately throughout the celebration of the sacrament throughout the year. We have the Calvin baptismal font. We have a font that came from Deer Park. We have banners in the sanctuary that came specifically from the Deer Park sanctuary that have blended into the sanctuary at Calvin. And of course, our resources like hymn books and creeds, and the way that we do affirmation of faith in our worship services, and the way that we use Voices United, as well as the Presbyterian Book of Praise, all of that came along and still continues to be used in the space.
One of the more unusual sharings, I think, in the early days was that we still had two choirs. Calvin had its choir, and Deer Park brought its choir over, and they even brought their organist. So there were Sundays when we were singing out of the United Church hymn book, one week the Presbyterian one the next. The Deer Park choir would sing their anthem, the Calvin would sing their anthem, and the organists would slide on and off the choir bench, or the organ bench, as they needed to. And we really did emphasize bringing everything that was of value to the congregation, and figured that if we had lots and lots of baptismal fonts and tables, that would not be a problem. The important part was the real sense of hospitality and sharing. And in lots of ways, that really formulated how we first came together, including this formative story about the first day that they came over.
And I think as Ian tells this story about that first Sunday, it's interesting to know that this is a story that's invoked in the life of the congregation quite frequently. I certainly was told it when I arrived at Calvin 6 years ago. It continues to come up as a memory within the minds, both of the Calvin folks from their perspective on it, and the Deer Park folks on their perspective, and how it galvanized the two congregations for life together. So
yeah, so what happened on that first day wasn't planned so much as a result of some of the conversations we'd been having and preparation we've had. Deer Park started their service in their church, and Calvin started their Sunday morning worship service at Calvin. And soon after the beginning of worship, Deer Park left its church and marched as a group down the street and knocked on the door of Calvin Church. And we answered the door, and they came in, and there was a bit of a liturgy at the door. But by instinct, after all of this hard work that both congregations had done around pastoral thoughtfulness, the Calvin people had positioned themselves at the far ends of the pews, so it was easy for the Deer Park people to come in and sit down. And the Calvin crew had sort of turned their back to the front of the church to welcome the new people who had come in. So there was a real anticipation that was natural and not planned or scripted. And it was a formative moment, I think, as you hear the Deer Park people talk about the welcoming faces, and that there was a place to sit, and they immediately felt welcome. I think that putting a lot of effort into the pastoral care and the thoughtfulness and the planning and the education and the endless amounts of communication is essential in all of this.
Yeah, they really do talk a lot about, maybe it's because pews are so sacred in so many of our congregations, but the idea that people moved from the centers of the pews to the edges, so that as they came down the center aisle, people could find a place to sit, and they were singing as that happened. So they were able to immediately find a place and do something together. They were joined in worship right from that very first Sunday, and then from there, things like the preaching and the prayers helped solidify, I guess, what had already begun in two separate buildings, in two separate congregations, into one. It doesn't stop the people from still asking, well, how do you do that? Do you sit together in the pews? Do you, just this past Sunday, one of the greeters who was a Deer Park person laughingly called me over and said, I actually just had someone ask me whether this was both Deer Park United and Calvin Presbyterian worshiping here. And when I said yes, he asked whether he should sit on one side or the other according to whether he was United or Presbyterian. So even still 10 years on, we get some of those questions, but those questions were resolved right at the very beginning. This is a shared endeavor. We're going to share our space and our life.
For as much sharing as there are still some liturgical distinctions that were maintained, at least early on. I'm not sure about now, but when there was a person being baptized who was Presbyterian, we used a Presbyterian liturgy. A United Church baptism required a United Church liturgy, regardless of which minister was doing it. In at least one case, I used the United Church liturgy to do a United Church baptism at Calvin when the minister wasn't available. So we did try to keep some distinctives and to be as flexible and be as variable as possible.
Yeah, I think this would be a good opportunity to see what questions you have or comments or how this relates to your own experience in your own places. And then we do have some things about living together and what's happened since the coming together. It's been 10 years for Calvin and Deer Park, so lots of things have happened, but it would be great to hear from some of you all who are listening.
Especially, I think we should say people might have questions about what didn't work. We've talked a lot about what did work, and behind all of these conversations about what worked and liturgy, there were lots of questions about money and financial arrangements, judicatory sharing.
And what gets shared and what doesn't get shared, and how you, there's all kinds of back questions there.
I'd offer the comment that from my experience elsewhere, from where I am now, that the communication is the most important thing, and how to make it welcoming. So as you pointed out, there isn't a winner and a loser in the situation, and how careful you have to be about that.
Absolutely. And that's a recurring thing. It's not just at the beginning, winners and losers and heroes and saviors, but it can be an ongoing kind of issue that you remind each other that you're on equal footing. This is a shared endeavor, and there are things that you don't necessarily have to do together, and other things that you really do have together, and you have different gifts to contribute. I think that's the communication and is ongoing, both at the beginning and all the way through.
The communication also helped, I think, to cut down on the amount of sabotage that can sometimes sneak into these things. Either sabotage from people who were trying to actively undo things by asking questions or circulating information that wasn't quite true. But there's also that internal sabotage that happens when I can think of a number of conversations we had just about where would where would dishes be stored and that kind of thing. And all the old fights that Calvin had internally all of a sudden came back to life again as it contemplated sharing space. And the number of times when where things would be hung or stored were about to throw the whole discussion off course. It wasn't the theological issues that were the problem. It was
the little things.
the little things.
Yeah.
And the communication, I think, helped name those things and to help us overcome them.
Mm-hmm. And there was loss of membership on both sides as they went into this and decided, yes, we're going to do this. This is the direction we're going to go. So sometimes I hear people say that one of the reasons that it worked as well as it did is because the extreme naysayers excused themselves before it even got started, which is just reality.
A question, do you have the rates of attrition for the two congregations?
Only anecdotally, and I can only speak from the Presbyterian side. I would have said there might have been maybe 5 households that disappeared to some extent or another. It's not as though not everybody who disappeared forever or always. Some of them disappeared for a short time and then came back. Some did disappear forever, and some just sort of became more casually attached as there were fewer people that they recognized or knew, or they felt they had a smaller voice in the overall size. Mm. Deer Park probably experienced a greater loss just because they lost their building, and a number of people who maybe had moved far away from the building and were commuting a long distance sort of decided that they would stay closer to home and not make the trek anymore when the building was lost, which was something they identified too for a variety of reasons. Mm-hmm. Maybe you know better than I.
Well, I don't know a lot more than you do. And again, it's all anecdotal. I think it's interesting that now, having just marked 10 years together in ecumenical shared ministry and had some events around that, there was a significant homecoming to both at this time in the 10 years when someone would show up to an event that all the Deer Park people know and love, and they were welcomed in as if they'd been there all along, but they had made a decision at the time of the joining together of the congregations that they weren't going to be an official part of that. It also happened when Marie, the minister of the Deer Park congregation, retired. We had a lot of influx of folks who had been at Deer Park who came to some of those events, and we gained some of them into the worship life of the congregation. So there is a real coming and going, I think. And I saw that happen some on Calvin's side too, but more for Deer Park.
We were also fortunate to have a number of other ecumenical partners nearby. I can think especially of an Anglican colleague who was very good at telling people they needed to go back to their church and assuring them that this was an okay thing, that what we were doing by experimenting together was okay, and that our colleagues would encourage people to be patient and to stick it out and to be supportive. Mm-hmm. Yes. So we were lucky to have that support around us as well.
I think Derek may have had or put his microphone on at one point. I don't know if you still have a comment. Yeah.
Oh, I wonder if.
There he is.
No, I just got logged off, so I had to log back in.
Okay, well, welcome back.
Gail, I wonder if you have any things that you want to add in terms of the policy or your experience in the office.
And Paul may want to speak to this as well. No, I think it's, and I've had some awareness of the Deer Park Calvin situation all along because of colleagues that were part of that. So no, it's good to hear what you're saying. I think it's consistent with what I've heard in other places where people are trying to enter into ecumenical shared ministries in terms especially of the intentionality, the pastoral work, and the education. And I think, my hope is that something like this webinar becomes part of the education that we do for people as you say, to see this as a creative possibility for ministry in different situations. And I think that's our hope in the whole Ecumenical Shared Ministries task group, that we help people to imagine outside the box of what might be the usual quick step to amalgamation or something like that. Yeah. I guess one of I'd be interested to hear more in terms of liturgical distinctives around communion and how that was handled. And also, you did have both United and Presbyterian clergy. Do you still, or is it one person? I mean, which is the case in most shared ministries, it's one or the other denomination, because most can't have more than one clergy person, but that would be a question.
At Calvin Deer Park, we do still have both, and I think that that's a central feature of the ecumenical shared ministry in this particular place, that it was important to both congregations to have a minister of their own, but it also makes team ministry possible in a place where it's not financially viable for either congregation to have more than one staff person. So in this case, Calvin, I'm full-time at Calvin, and my colleague at the United Church is 2/3 time, something like that. But we share in all areas of ministry together. So that was the case when it started, and then both congregations have gone through the process of calling a new minister into the ecumenical shared ministry, which in and of itself was something that had to be figured out around learning each other's search process, how you give representation to the other denomination and in the call process, while preserving the call process as something that each denomination does according to their own polity and according to their own sense of discernment. And I think that was an interesting journey, both times that it's happened, when I was called to Calvin and when my colleague was called to Deer Park. So for us, having a minister from both traditions and both denominations is of high priority to the congregations.
Yeah. In terms of the liturgical work that was done, we were probably fortunate in that both congregations, while having an established, valued liturgical tradition, had as part of that valued liturgical tradition an appreciation for variance and experimentation. So while both Calvin and Deer Park Sunday worship would be considered formal or traditional looking, there had been many decades of tradition in both congregations around experimenting with different styles of worship, different liturgies, large and small gatherings for communion and baptism. And I think that having a spirit of experimentation in a congregation is always good, because it prepares you for it. Stretching those muscles makes everyone more flexible so they can respond to whatever comes anyway. We were fortunate to have that tradition of flexibility, limited flexibility, but not endless flexibility in both congregations. There were some ironies along the way. For instance, Calvin used the ecumenical version or the updated version of the Lord's Prayer, whereas Deer Park did not. So there were these funny situations where what you would expect the Presbyterians to be doing was less traditional than what the United Church might have been doing, and some of the more traditional things that you would expect Presbyterians to be doing, we weren't, but the United Church was. So there was some fun play there.
It still comes up at the worship committee every once in a while. Could we say the Lord's Prayer in using trespasses, which is what Deer Park came with, for a season? Can we do that for Lent? Can we,
Sure.
And that's an interesting ongoing conversation.
Yeah, and at least while I was there, we did play around with which version of the Lord's Prayer we used in different contexts. Mm-hmm. But in terms of communion, we used very similar liturgies in lots of ways already. And the minister from the United Church and I had very similar sensibilities, or were willing to indulge each other's peculiarities. As long as we understood why each other were doing it and what it meant, and appreciating the traditions of the other congregation, and taking it slow. But we didn't ever run into any liturgical problems around communion or baptism that I recall. That the biggest area of debate around that was whether or not we would have a cross on the communion table, which was the United Church's tradition when there wasn't communion being celebrated, or whether it would be left plain. And I think that debate continues.
The cross comes and goes, depending on who's setting up the sanctuary for what. And sometimes it is over on the Deer Park communion table, and sometimes it gets put on the Calvin communion table, and then someone from Calvin doesn't like that, and it gets moved again. And so, it goes on. But
where that would be a bigger factor, I think, is when a United or Presbyterian church is working with a Lutheran or Anglican church. Although even then, many of our liturgies, denominational liturgies, are similar enough that it could work, I think, with the appropriate amount of education and practice and pastoral care. And I was shocked at the amount of movement that could be made just with a visit to somebody's home or an intentional conversation. As people talked about their concerns about making sure things were done right, or they weren't betraying their family's tradition, or what they thought was Presbyterian or thought was United.
One thing that we've introduced into the baptism service and also into new members services, and that's been an interesting point of conversation too, because we've had people, we have couples in the church where one spouse is United and one spouse is Presbyterian, and people are drawn to the congregation because they have varying backgrounds in United and Presbyterian churches, and they want some place where they can both come to worship happily. We also have had people come to the congregation, and when they're asked about membership, they say, yes, they would like to join Calvin Deer Park. And we say, well, no, you have to join either Calvin or Deer Park. And many people choose based on their own history or where they've made connections, personal connections within the congregation. But there's there are a few people who will say, well, I'm not going to join one or the other. And so they remain as adherents to the congregation because they don't want to choose. So partly in response to that, and partly because the ecumenical shared ministry has become such a priority for both congregations, in the baptismal liturgy and questions that we ask to parents around the life of the congregation and raising your child in the Christian faith, and more particularly in new membership, is a question around helping us uphold the relationship between the two congregations and to promote it in what we do. Will you, as you join one congregation, will you be an advocate for the shared ministry and going forward together, which that's evolved over time, but has become a part of those liturgies.
Yeah, in my experience at least, the liturgy and the pastoral care work superseded and made all the judicatory stuff, all the money stuff work. As long as we could get the communication, the pastoral stuff, the liturgical stuff working, everything else kind of fell into place, more or less. Really, even the debates about how the finances would work was the least complicated part of our working things out.
That's very interesting.
In the early days, I don't. Since then, it may have changed, but it was the least onerous part of the work.
I think it is interesting in this particular configuration because, to emphasize something we said at the beginning, this can take all different kinds of forms. Calvin and Deer Park made some particular choices about what to do together and what to keep separate. And because Calvin has the building and owns the building, Calvin has a property committee, and Deer Park doesn't have a property committee. We consult one another in capital projects to the building. There's a sharing in the cost of that that's all been worked out in finer details. What we do together is outreach, and we have a joint committee for outreach with a chair that is someone from Deer Park for 2 years and then switches over to someone from Calvin. Our worship and hospitality committee is all joint, and that takes care of looking after music in the congregation. The choirs have now come together into one choir. We have one choir with a shared director of music ministry, an organist, and a choir director who works together, but we have section leads in the choir, some of which are paid for by Deer Park and some of which are paid for by Calvin. So outreach, worship, and hospitality, which includes music, and education, our educational programming is all done together. But we, the congregations are financially distinct from one another, and they share in costs as it's laid out in their agreement. And pastorally, they remain distinct in that it's clear that the minister of Calvin is the primary pastoral caregiver for the members and adherents of Calvin, and the minister at Deer Park is the primary pastoral caregiver for the members and adherents at Deer Park. And the two congregations have pastoral care teams or committees that work for each congregation rather than a crossover of those congregations. And that's been important for us going forward. It's also, those lines get blurred all the time because you have two ministers leading worship, and you have people that make particular connections with one or other of those ministers, which may or may not be the minister of the congregation that you're officially a member of. So there's certainly a crossover of caregiving and sharing of our life together, but there's also a distinction there, which we've found to be helpful and important in this particular case. That could be completely different in a different ecumenical shared ministry.
Early on, the image that we used was a marriage. Well, at first we were just living together because we were simply sharing space. We hadn't decided to formally create an ecumenical shared ministry. So we lived together and then we got married. It was a very modern operation. But the marriage was helpful. The marriage imagery was helpful because it did recognize that we each brought our own traditions, our own families, our own values into the marriage. We would share things, but we would not try to be the same. We would recognize that we each came from separate families. We each owed our families of origin certain things and certain allegiances, but that we were willing to share them to some extent or another, maintain our distinctives, but live together and work together and create a family together. And that we didn't need to worry about becoming the same because we were confident enough in our individuality.
And there were strong enough personalities, as there would be in any of your communities, that would make sure that the distinctions, in healthy ways, as well as sometimes in not so helpful ways, get maintained. And I think we've grown in the 10 years. We've grown for a while. When I first came into the ecumenical shared ministry, there was a sense that, well, if it's a Presbyterian Church initiative, you really can't talk about it in worship because that's a shared space. And so we're not going to promote that because some people would feel left out, and the same on the United Church side. And it's still a learning curve, but there is now a sense that, well, of course we would promote a particular Presbyterian initiative or a particular United Church initiative, or we would find some way to bring them together. So when we want to bring in a speaker from Presbyterian World Service and Development, we talk ahead of time about how we'd like that person to not only talk about Presbyterian initiatives, but what are all the range of ministries that the United Church and the Presbyterian Church support together, and how can we make that a conversation that everybody gets to be a part of in some way or another. Same thing with promoting Gifts of Change at Christmas time. We have both the UCC catalog and the Presbyterian Church in Canada's catalog available, and we talk about that together. We've done a joint stewardship campaign where we have a worship piece of it, where we invite members of both Calvin and Deer Park to share publicly in worship what the church means to them and what they value about it. And then we had 2 separate stewardship campaigns going on within the 2 denominations, but then we came back together for a Sunday where everyone made a financial pledge and were invited into a liturgy around stewardship. So we've tried to find some creative ways where we can do things together that you might think at first glance is just for one denomination or the other.
And like a marriage, again, that has changed. So the nature of the relationship and the closeness and what you share and what you don't share and the things that you do in common and separately have evolved.
It evolves, it ebbs and flows. You know, there's, Yeah, we're getting close to the end of our time. Are there more questions or observations or things we missed?
I'd ask, what did the presbyteries for both denominations stand back and let you folks figure it out, or was there any input from them?
Yeah, we each congregation identified the presbytery as someone that, of course, we needed to be in contact with regularly, and we asked each presbytery to name somebody who would be our contact, who was outside the ministers of the congregations that were represented in the discussions. By and large, both presbyteries were very hands-off. There was very little involvement by the presbyteries. They didn't know much about this process before the two congregations started to talk about it. So again, we were in education mode and we were in communication mode. So we really worked hard, or at least I can't speak as much about the United Church side, but from my side, we wrote a lot of letters to the presbytery, tried to assure them that we were doing something that was normal and in line with some policies that our church had agreed to, and that we were covering all the things that needed to be covered. There were never any questions of substance at the Presbyterian presbytery, but we really did, again, try hard to communicate as much as possible. I probably wrote letters and kept them up to date in ways that weren't necessary, but we figured that more communication was better than less.
That's a good principle for the whole thing. Yeah. Are there other questions?
Or observations or
from the United Church perspective or Lutheran perspective, or Derek, I think.
Would you advise on having an outside facilitator for a process like that, or the clergy who are presently in relationship with the congregations?
We didn't have one. A couple of times the presbytery reps sat in with us just to make sure that everything was covered, but the ministers and the elders in both congregations already knew much more about this than the outsiders who were present did. This is maybe a cop-out, but I would say it's contextual. In the situation we were in, we didn't need an outside facilitator, but I could imagine situations where you did need one. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that might be contextual. There might not be a rule about that. It wouldn't hurt to have other people who are supportive and who could jump in as needed. Sort of the rule that the colleague that I worked with in the United Church on this with was, as long as we got along, everything else kind of worked. And that proved to be true. I wish there were a better answer for that.
What if one of the congregations doesn't have a minister?
Oh, yeah. That makes it so much harder. In which case the inter-moderator or a presbytery representative would have to be chosen very carefully and have, I think, the trust of the congregation. The building of trust is what all those visits and the liturgical work and the education was about. I would think that if the other church didn't have a minister in place, or if one of the churches had a minister in place and the pastoral relationship wasn't strong, an outside facilitator would be important. And also maybe where the churches were not very equal. If there was one congregation or one charge that had significantly more people or resources or money, I guess, if there was a sense of imbalance that couldn't be worked through as a result of the trust that was in place with the leadership, an outside facilitator would be essential, I think.
And maybe in that case, I'm not speaking from experience, but maybe in that case also finding increased ways for members of the congregation to meet together formally and informally to make sure that you're facilitating relationships within the two congregations. So independently of the leadership to a certain extent, if you're able to open up the lines of communication between members and create some friendships, then you create a network or a net that maybe allows some more official conversations to happen on a leadership level.
And by leadership, and I've said a lot about the ministers, but by no means was this exclusively minister-led. We had very, very good, strong, trusted elders and non-elders in both congregations who forged really important relationships that ensured that we didn't need a facilitator. But we may have been fortunate in that regard.
Well, and those lay relationships continue to be very strong, and it allows both congregations to have a real sense of ownership over this ecumenical shared ministry. It is definitely something that they take pride in, that they created, that they value, and that they want to preserve in all the decisions they make. One of the questions they ask themselves is, how does this affect the other congregation? How does this affect the shared ministry? And that wouldn't be the case if it was just minister driven.
Yeah, I think even as the ministers got along and were oriented towards this kind of sharing at the beginning, if it hadn't been for key elders and non-elders who said, this is a good idea, I want to do it, it wouldn't have happened. It's a bit like, to go back to the marriage thing, you could have a matchmaker, but unless both parties want to get married, the matchmaking doesn't work very well. So a facilitator could be a useful thing, or might be seen as a presbytery imposing something, but I think that's context. Actually.
So we've reached the 2 o'clock point, and I just want to make sure we're respectful of people's time. This has been such an amazing conversation. Thank you, Ian and Emily, for sharing all your knowledge with us. And I also want to thank everybody who's attended, because your experience and knowledge has contributed to this conversation so much as well. We would be very happy to hear from you. Like, if there are further questions, you can get into contact with us at canadianministries@presbyterian.ca, and through our Presbyterian website. You know, the people who monitor that will be able to forward any messages to Emily or to Ian or to myself. So just feel free. We're always here if there is any more discussion or questions that are happening, especially from Presbyterian congregations who might be considering ecumenical shared ministries. We're always happy to talk about the possibilities and provide more information. So Ian and Emily, do you have anything further you'd like to add?
I think just to say that Emily and I would be happy to talk to any congregation or any ministers or presbyteries anytime from any denomination. If you found our experience helpful, or if you think that us speaking to congregations or sessions would be helpful, we'd be more than happy to do that any way we could.
Absolutely.
And this, a recording of this webinar will be available probably within the next couple days. So if you would like to share it, or you have a church congregation you know that's considering ecumenical shared ministry, it might be some of these tips about intentionality, pastoral care, education. These are things that would be great for people to be thinking about as they even in the very, very early stages of considering this possibility. So thank you to you both, and thank you for everyone who joined. Many blessings on all of your ministries. We just thank God for the many ways that there's these partnerships with other denominations, and we're just so grateful, and we will be praying for you and for all of the ecumenical shared ministries across the country. So thank you very much, and we'll be signing off now. I hope you have a great day, and check out our website for more of our amazing Presbyterian webinars, because there's a lot on stewardship and everything, and we're always happy to have anyone who's interested join us. So thank you very much, and have a great day.